On the evening of the 2nd of July, 1872, Hannah Cullwick finished washing the dishes and then washed herself. Her paid work was over, but another kind of labor began. She sat down and wrote the history of every place in which she had served. She called it Hannah's Places. The surviving account says she wrote it in one sitting. Before 9:30, she had posted the pages. By 11, she was in bed. That hurried packet is one of the hidden words Victorian servants left behind. It gives us more than a list of duties. It shows a working woman choosing the shape of her own past, while an employer still claimed most of her waking day. If evidence-led history matters to you, subscribe to Dynasty and Dust, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. A servant's page could preserve a judgment that didn't belong to the house. Yet survival was never simple. It depended on time, literacy, paper, a keeper, and sometimes another person's pen. Before the midpoint, we'll reach a diary once held together by two cheap tags. Its damaged leaves will answer a harder question. When a household controlled a worker's hours, housing, character, and future reference, what could that worker still keep? To understand why Hannah's evening mattered, we have to begin with a man who distrusted his own handwriting. His name was William Tayler. He didn't start a diary because he believed himself important. He started because he thought his writing was bad. William was born in the rural hamlet of Grafton in 1807. His father farmed on a small scale and had many children to settle. There wasn't room for every son to remain on the land. William entered gentleman's service. Like many country-born workers, he eventually followed employment toward London. By the opening of 1837, he was a footman in the Marylebone household of Mrs. Prinsep. The address was Great Cumberland Street, close to Marble Arch. Its respectable front concealed the ordinary division on which domestic comfort rested. Mrs. Prinsep and her adult daughter occupied the household as family. 3 maids, and William occupied it as servants. He was the only male servant there. A footman's work joined display to exertion. He answered doors, waited at table, carried messages, accompanied carriages, and made a household's movement appear smooth. His body was visible when status required it, and unobtrusive when comfort required that. William's page altered that arrangement. On paper, he wasn't a furnishing in livery. He was the observer. He planned to note the chief things that came under his eye each day. The entries would be short because his book was small and his time wasn't large. That explanation is almost a miniature contract with the future. The house had taken most of the day. The little book would take what remained. His first motive was practice. Friends had urged him to use his pen more often, but earlier attempts had faded through fatigue or forgetfulness. A daily journal could turn improvement into habit. The result wasn't a polished literary performance. Spelling wandered, temper showed. The pen itself sometimes became an enemy. None of that weakens the document. It is the reason the document breathes. When influenza spread through London that January, William was kept indoors to help the sick. He disliked being confined. The following day, he escaped for a short walk and noticed a new street scraping machine. The device seized his attention. He described its wheels, handles, width, and motion. One man, people said, could use it to do the work of several. You can hear two kinds of curiosity meeting there. One belonged to a footman hungry to get outside. The other belonged to a worker evaluating a machine through the labor it displaced. An employer might have recorded the weather or a social call. William recorded the mechanism that moved mud. That doesn't make every line a protest. A private diary isn't a secret manifesto merely because a servant wrote it. William could be sharp, conventional, impatient, amused, and unfair. He judged people freely. He complained. He noticed spectacle and vulgarity with equal appetite. At Brighton races, he saw heat, crowds, gambling, and disorder, and his language wasn't decorous. This is useful because it resists the tidy servant we often inherit from fiction. He wasn't always dutiful in thought. He didn't exist to improve an employer's story. He was inconsistent in the ordinary human way. One inconsistency became possible because his workplace and his home were not the same place, even though he lived at work. William was married. His position required him to sleep in Mrs. Prinsep's house. His wife lodged elsewhere. The arrangement sounds like a small biographical detail until you let it change the map. A live-in servant could have a spouse and child, yet the employer's roof still organized the family. William's wife moved through respectable lodgings in nearby streets. Their son was christened locally. Husband, wife, and child belonged to one family, but service divided their nights. The front door of Great Cumberland Street marked more than class. It stood between William's paid identity and much of his married life. He sometimes pretended that he was going to church and went to see his wife instead. The deception was slight. Its meaning wasn't. To cross that door for his own purpose, he needed a story acceptable to the household. A regulation book might tell us when a servant could go out. William's diary tells us what a married man did with the narrow space inside the rule. That is the difference between a system described from above and a life observed from within. It also explains why private writing could be dangerous without containing scandal. The page held a second account of obedience. In the visible account, the footman had gone where duty or respectability allowed. In his own account, he had chosen his wife. Domestic service is often summarized as a ladder. A boy or girl entered low, learned discipline, moved to a better place, and perhaps rose to authority. William's later career can be made to fit that shape. After Mrs. Prinsep died, he changed positions. He became a butler. In time, he could afford to rent a whole house in Paddington. Those changes mattered. Advancement brought money, standing, and more control over space. Yet the latter image can hide what William's diary restores. Each rung had days inside it. There were sick rooms, streets, carriages, crowded races, awkward errands, and stolen visits. There was a pen used after work by someone who had little time and no guarantee that strangers would ever care. His journal covered almost every day of that year. It survived long enough to be edited and printed in the 20th century. That survival may feel inevitable once a book has a title and a catalog record. It wasn't inevitable at all. Most household paper was vulnerable. Notes were used, folded, spilled upon, discarded, or burned. A servant's private book could look like clutter to descendants who didn't know the hand. Even a treasured diary could remain invisible in a drawer. Survival required somebody to keep the object, and somebody else to recognize its value. Publication added another series of decisions. The ink had to cross several doors. The published volume identifies William as a footman. That occupational label helps us find him now. It can also narrow him before we have heard him. Footman tells us where he stood in a household. It doesn't tell us what he saw from there. His eye moved beyond the drawing room. London in his diary is a working city of illness, transport, machines, mud, entertainment, and migration. He looked at labor because labor was legible to him. He also looked upward and sideways. Servants knew an employer's routines, but they watched one another too. A household wasn't a simple line between master and maid. It was a crowded structure of dependence. The cook might command a kitchen maid. A butler might supervise a footman. A senior servant could enforce the very discipline that constrained servants as a class. William's rise didn't carry him outside the system. It changed his location within it. That distinction matters when we say servants had a voice. There was no single servant voice. A married male footman in London didn't inhabit the same risks as a young orphaned girl entering a kitchen. Literacy itself divided workers. William could turn weak penmanship into daily practice. Another servant might read but write only with difficulty. Someone else might have no practical access to either skill. Paper cost money. Light cost money. Privacy was scarce. Fatigue could close the hand before ink reached a page. The ability to write wasn't merely a talent carried inside a person. It needed conditions. William tells us this without making an argument. His book was small. His time was limited. Those two constraints determined the scale of his entries. Yet scale isn't the same as significance. A few lines about going out can expose the boundary between service and marriage. A description of a road scraper can reveal a worker measuring invention against human effort. A complaint about confinement can put a body back inside an epidemic. The diary also changes the emotional temperature of the grand house. From the street, the address signaled security. Within William's account, it could feel restrictive, tedious, comic, or absurd. It also changes the speed of history. Large events usually reach us after institutions have named them. William encountered them as interruptions. Influenza wasn't yet a chapter in public health. It was the reason he couldn't go out. Street improvement wasn't an abstract advance. It was a machine he stopped to inspect. This scale is where ordinary people meet transformation. The diary doesn't know which observation later readers will call important. That innocence protects variety. William can place illness beside an outing because both belonged to the day. He can notice public technology without writing a theory of industrial change. The historian supplies the wider context later. The servant supplies the unplanned encounter. Comfort for one group didn't create serenity for everyone under the roof. This is where popular images of domestic service become unreliable. The silent servant in the background may be accurate as a rule of performance. Silence could be expected in a room. It doesn't follow that the worker had no language elsewhere. Below stairs, in a lodging, on an errand, or over a little book, judgment continued. The hidden part was not consciousness. It was access. We can only hear the thought that found a route into evidence. That problem grows larger when set against the scale of service. By the middle of the century, more than 1 million people in Britain worked as domestic servants. Among women who earned wages, service became the dominant occupation. The numbers can create an illusion of abundance. If so many people performed the work, surely their experiences must fill the record. In practice, a census line can preserve a name, an age, a birthplace, and an occupation, while leaving the day almost silent. Servant is one word. It might cover a girl in a farmhouse, a cook supervising a large kitchen, a groom in a stable, a nurse caring for children, or a butler managing the public face of a mansion. Their conditions weren't interchangeable. Even job titles could shift between houses. A general servant might cook, clean, carry coal, answer the door, and mind children, because no larger staff existed. In a wealthy establishment, the same duties were divided among specialists. Hierarchy changed the view from the page. A senior servant could write with the confidence of authority and still be subject to dismissal. A young maid might know the household's most intimate facts and lack a room that was fully her own. Knowledge didn't guarantee power. The architecture trained servants in that contradiction. Back stairs, basement passages, bells, service doors, and attic bedrooms allowed labor to circulate without interrupting the family's performance of ease. A bell transformed a person elsewhere in the building into an immediate response. It carried no explanation of what the worker had been doing. It simply announced that another claim had become urgent. When a diary survives, the line of attention reverses. The servant decides what matters enough to record. The great person may appear only as a source of delay, a journey, a command, or a mood. A machine in the street can receive more description than the drawing room. That reversal is easy to miss if we mine the page only for facts about employers. Historians once treated many servant documents as windows into elite homes. They are that, but the glass works both ways. William didn't exist to confirm what Mrs. Prinsep owned. His writing tells us how a worker organized attention under conditions that organized his body. He took the household's errands and connected them to London beyond the door. The city offered anonymity as well as risk. A country servant could disappear into its crowds, yet references and reputation still bound one job to the next. A bad character from an employer could close future doors. Live-in work made that dependence unusually complete. Losing a position could mean losing wages, meals, and a bed at the same moment. For a married worker like William, employment also shaped where family life could happen. He wasn't enslaved, and the distinction matters. He could leave, seek another place, and eventually rise. But legal freedom didn't remove practical pressure. Choice had a price. The private page captured the space between formal freedom and daily dependence. William could write that he disliked staying in. He could admit the false church errand. The diary didn't abolish the rule. It preserved the worker who bent it. That makes spelling errors historically valuable in a way polished recollection cannot imitate. They show the act of writing before an editor smoothed its surface. The uncertain hand remains visible inside the confidence of the observation. William complained that he was a poor writer, yet he kept going. Every entry made the original judgment less true. His pen didn't need to become elegant to become durable. Practice produced an archive. There is tenderness in that outcome, but we shouldn't make it sentimental. William wrote for himself, not for our gratitude. He couldn't know which descendants, editors, librarians, or listeners would handle his words. The meaning expanded after him. That expansion brings a responsibility. We shouldn't turn the diary into proof of claims it cannot support. It represents one man, one household, and 1 year with unusual closeness. It doesn't stand for every servant. Instead, it teaches us how to approach the voices that follow. We will ask who created the words, when they were fixed, who preserved them, and what power sat between the experience and the page. Those questions prevent authenticity from becoming a slogan. A first-person account can be candid and selective. Memory can sharpen an injury, while time blurs a date. An editor can clarify and also frame. The honest way to hear a servant isn't to pretend mediation disappears. It is to keep the chain visible while listening closely to what crossed it. William's chain begins with embarrassment. He believed his hand needed practice. The judgment might have stopped him. Instead, weakness became a method. He didn't postpone writing until his spelling, style, or schedule improved. That decision is transferable beyond his biography. Archives often depend on imperfect people beginning before they feel qualified. Polish can come through editing. The first observation cannot be recovered if nobody records it. William's route was direct enough to recognize. He chose the pen, kept the journal, and named his reason. Later editors shaped how the work reached print, but the entries remained his daily composition. The next voice reached the public by a more confrontational path. It belonged to a woman who had spent years moving through other people's rooms. Her experience began before Victoria's reign. Her answer arrived inside it. Ann Ashford didn't merely leave a diary for later discovery. In 1844, she printed a book about her own life. She placed a servant's account into the marketplace, while the social world she described could still answer back. That act changed the stakes. A diary may be private at the moment of writing. A printed memoir makes a claim upon strangers. It asks readers to accept that the writer's memory deserves space beside the stories told about her. Ann had reasons to insist. She had entered service as a child, without the protection of living parents. She learned that a household could feed, house, and employ a young woman, while also controlling the knowledge she needed to leave. The obstacle wasn't only hard work. It was the possibility that training itself could be withheld. William's diary showed a man slipping through a door to preserve a piece of family life. Ann's account will show an employer using an interior door differently. She was sent away from the room when a useful skill was being performed. The purpose, as she understood it, was to stop her learning enough to seek a better place. The household didn't simply purchase labor already possessed. It could ration the worker's future. At that point, ink becomes more than memory. It becomes a countermeasure. Ann Ashford was born in London in 1787, 50 years before Victoria came to the throne. By the time she was about 13, both parents were gone. Relatives remained, but orphanhood had changed the terms of dependence. She chose to enter service. The decision embarrassed members of an upwardly mobile family. Respectability could praise diligent servants in theory, while treating service as a fall for one of its own daughters. Mary Ann crossed that threshold anyway. Her first position lasted only a few months. It began a sequence of 13 places across roughly 17 years. Her age exposes another false simplicity in the word servant. At 13, she was old enough to earn wages and young enough to need teaching. Employment was expected to do both. But the two purposes could conflict. An employer wanted useful labor immediately. A girl needed skills that would improve her next year. There was no universal state system guaranteeing a long childhood in school. Opportunities depended on family, charity, religion, locality, and money. Reading ability spread unevenly. Writing required further practice. Mary Ann's later authorship proves that she found a way to command prose. It doesn't mean every girl beside her received the same chance. The early household was therefore an educational institution, whether it admitted the role or not. A mistress could teach methods, manners, accounts, recipes, and routines. She could also keep them back. This made domestic training morally ambiguous. Employers complained about inexperienced girls and then feared losing those who became experienced. A servant could be blamed for ignorance, while the household protected the ignorance. Mary Ann's 13 positions also remind us that service was a labor market, not a permanent caste assigned at birth. Workers moved between places, negotiated wages, and sought improvement. That movement gave employers a reason to control references and knowledge. The number matters because every new place required another negotiation of character. A servant could leave one household, but the former employer might help decide whether the next door opened. References turned memory into leverage. If a mistress described a departing maid as dishonest, idle, insolent, or incapable, the charge could follow her without a fair hearing. The employer's spoken sentence traveled farther than the servant's explanation. Mary Ann encountered that imbalance early. In one place, she tried to give warning and move on. When prospective employers asked for her character, the mistress said enough to break the arrangement. There was no neutral personnel file to correct. Remaining became a form of compulsion, produced without chains. Mary Ann was legally able to leave. Yet leaving without a usable character might replace one bad place with unemployment, homelessness, or hunger. That is why the word choice needs care. She wasn't property. She was a wage earner whose practical choices could be narrowed by someone who controlled food, lodging, money, and reputation together. The house was both workplace and address. An industrial laborer might suffer dismissal and still return to the same rented room that night. A live-in servant could receive a command to go and lose shelter with the job. Mary Ann's memoir records arbitrary dismissals beside theft, deception, isolation, and deductions from wages. These weren't identical injuries. Together, they reveal how many parts of life passed through the employment relationship. Money could vanish before reaching her hand. One employer claimed deductions for things Mary Ann believed shouldn't have been charged to her. Another dispute might center on clothing, breakage, or the terms under which she had been hired. A yearly wage sounded definite when spoken. Its reality depended on what was withheld. When payment came, and whether the servant could challenge the accounting. She had little bargaining power alone. The most revealing struggle, however, concerned knowledge. In one household, Mary Ann was made to nurse a child and perform the laborious tasks. Work requiring skill was treated differently. When the mistress prepared something that Mary Ann might learn from, she sent the girl away with the little boy. The explanation Mary Ann later gave was blunt. The mistress didn't want her qualified for a better place. This is a different kind of locked door. The employer wasn't only guarding a room or cupboard. She was guarding a technique that might raise a worker's value elsewhere. Skill meant mobility. A servant who could cook well might command higher wages than one employed for general drudgery. Someone trusted with complex household work could present herself for a better position. Training, therefore, could threaten retention. By keeping Mary Ann useful but unqualified, the mistress protected her own supply of labor. Mary Ann recognized the design. That recognition is the memoir's power. A household manual might describe how to train a servant efficiently. An employer's letter might complain that girls left as soon as they learned enough to improve themselves. Mary Ann supplies the view from the person being kept ignorant. She wasn't asking us to marvel that work was difficult. The injury lay in purposeful limitation. Her effort was accepted, while her development was obstructed. You can picture the motion without inventing the room. A task begins. Mary Ann is given the child. The door closes on the knowledge that could help her leave. The child is real work, not leisure. That is what makes the arrangement so efficient. The employer can deny training while remaining able to say the girl was occupied. Productive labor becomes the instrument that prevents advancement. Mary Ann eventually learned enough to rise from housemaid and general service to work as a cook. The blocked lesson delayed her. It didn't define the end of her ability. Her route through 13 households became an education assembled under resistance. Every move exposed another variation of authority. Some employers were kind. Others offered lessons in suspicion. A servant's memoir that described nothing but cruelty would be simple to dismiss as a fixed grievance. Mary Ann's account is harder than that. It is unsentimental. She could value decency when she found it, and identify exploitation when she didn't. The contrast matters because it shows she wasn't merely applying one accusation to every household. She compared conditions. Comparison is a form of worker knowledge. A girl in her first place may believe every rule is universal. By the 13th, Mary Ann could distinguish a necessary demand from a particular person's abuse of power. The households had trained her in ways their owners didn't intend. They taught her the patterns that would later organize her book. Theft wasn't an isolated shock. Isolation wasn't a mood. Dismissal wasn't just a change of address. Repeated experience turned incidents into a system. Yet the memoir doesn't read like a modern labor report. Mary Ann constructed a life, including family, marriages, loss, and military bureaucracy. Service was central, but it wasn't the only identity she claimed. In 1817, she married James Allison. He was a sergeant shoemaker at the Royal Military Asylum in Chelsea. They had 6 children. When James died, widowhood produced another contest with institutions. Mary Ann struggled to obtain the pension she believed was due. The household economy that had always required calculation became even more exposed. She later married Edward Green, a Sergeant Tayler at the same asylum. Military quarters offered shelter with conditions. Her children from the first marriage couldn't simply be absorbed into the new arrangement. Again, home was attached to somebody's service. The setting had changed from a private employer's house to a military institution. The underlying question remained: who was permitted to live under a roof connected to employment, and whose family counted? Mary Ann's children met the boundary. This wider life explains why the title of her book matters. She called it Life of a Licensed Victualler's Daughter. She didn't put servant first. The choice reached backward to origin. Service was something she had done, not the only noun available for her. Daughter placed her within family history before orphanhood and employment. Life claimed the full span. The title also signals a contest over social position. A woman whom relatives had not expected to serve could narrate the descent, labor, and survival without accepting that occupation erased ancestry. She named herself before readers named her. In 1844, she arranged for the memoir to be published. Scholars describe it as self-published. That phrase can sound effortless now, as if she merely uploaded a finished document. It required money, a printer, and faith that an audience might buy the result. The book was short. Its reach appears to have been limited. No secure sales record or large body of reviews has surfaced. Publication didn't make Mary Ann famous. It also didn't guarantee that readers knew what kind of book they were holding. A title centered on a licensed victualler's daughter could be mistaken for a moral tale or curiosity. Working people's autobiography occupied an unstable place in print. Publishers and readers often preferred conversion, crime, adventure, or exemplary suffering to the unadorned mechanics of employment. Mary Ann offered something more difficult to package. Her antagonists weren't monsters from melodrama. They were people using familiar rites of household management. The tension came from what those rites allowed them to do. That ordinariness is precisely why the memoir can feel modern. An employer who blocks a reference doesn't need to raise her voice. A mistress who sends a girl away from skilled work can describe the command as childcare. Power works cleanly when its purpose remains deniable. The printed account supplies the connection that the isolated incidents lack. Mary Ann can place the lost opportunity beside the blocked character and wage dispute. Readers see a pattern no single employer had to acknowledge. That pattern also explains why stories centered only on spectacular cruelty can mislead. The harshest power may operate through a reasonable-looking procedure. A reference is normal. Training at an employer's discretion is normal. Notice, deductions, and live-in rules are normal. When those procedures align against one worker, normality becomes the mechanism of harm. Mary Ann's memoir notices accumulation. The injury is not one locked room. It is a sequence of small decisions that make departure more expensive and endurance more likely. It did something more durable. It moved her account beyond a single-family archive. Copies could enter libraries and catalogs. A grievance once vulnerable to an employer's denial became a printed object. Ink had crossed the door. Think about the reversal. During service, A mistress's private comment could ruin Mary Ann's chance at another place. In print, Mary Ann could describe the mistress's method to unknown readers. The employer had controlled the character reference. The former servant controlled the narrative frame. That doesn't mean the book settled every factual dispute. Autobiography is evidence shaped by memory and purpose. Mary Ann was looking back across decades at some experiences. Dates can blur. Conversations may be compressed. Pain can remain vivid after surrounding detail has faded. The responsible response isn't to discard her voice or repeat every line without question. It is to test what can be tested and preserve the difference between memory, documentation, and interpretation. Her broad career can be anchored by the book's chronology and later research. The precise motive she attributes to an employer belongs to her retrospective understanding of the event. We can say she believed training was deliberately withheld. We can't enter the mistress's mind and make that motive independently certain. This distinction protects Mary Ann's testimony rather than weakening it. It lets her speak without making us pretend. A single memoir is an omniscient camera. The same care applies to emotional detail. Isolation in a live-in place wasn't merely being alone in a room. It meant lacking an ally when the employer defined the dispute. A servant, far from family, might have nowhere safe to compare accounts. Mary Ann knew what friendlessness could cost. Later writing about servant labor repeatedly returns to the power of a character. A worker without friends or reference could be forced to endure conditions because another place remained inaccessible. The law might say she could quit. The market asked who would vouch for her. This distinction between formal and usable freedom is one of the memoir's deepest information advantages. It helps explain behavior that can otherwise look passive. Why didn't a badly treated servant simply leave? The question assumes that departure ends at the front gate. For Mary Ann, it continued through lost lodging, unpaid or reduced wages, the search for work, and an employer's report. Leaving was an event chain. Every link could fail. The book also complicates the image of servants as members of a household family. Employers often used familial language to describe loyalty. A faithful servant might be praised as devoted or almost one of us. The phrase could offer real affection. It could also conceal unequal rights. A daughter of the family wasn't normally dismissed without a home because she disputed a deduction. A son didn't need a character from his mother to enter the next household. Mary Ann's own family had recoiled at service, perhaps because they understood some of that distance. Yet family protection wasn't enough to prevent the orphan from needing wages. Class feeling and material need pulled in opposite directions. She carried both into her account. That is why her memoir isn't merely a catalog of bad mistresses. It is a study in how identity changes when security disappears. The licensed victualler's daughter became a servant, cook, wife, mother, widow, claimant, and author. Each role altered the next. No household could contain the whole sequence. The form she chose could. Autobiography lets one person connect episodes that institutions keep separate. An employer remembers a maid's months in one place. Mary Ann remembers 13 places as one life. That continuity is a kind of power. The employer may control the current reference, but the worker controls comparison across time when she can preserve it. Memory gathers what doors divided. Printing fixes that gathering into an object others can hold. The book becomes portable evidence. Unlike oral explanation delivered during a tense interview, it can outlast the social advantage of the people described. Mary Ann's account appeared early in Victoria's reign, but most of the domestic service it recounts belonged to the Georgian decades. We shouldn't move those years forward merely because the book was Victorian. The distinction makes the story stronger. A woman, shaped by earlier service, used Victorian print to challenge inherited assumptions about the household. The new reign didn't create her injuries. It created the moment in which her answer appeared. Readers of the 1840s encountered a voice that fiction often softened. The ideal servant of employer-centered stories was loyal, selfless, grateful, and morally rewarded. Mary Ann's experience was less comforting. Loyalty could be exploited. Work didn't guarantee instruction. Honesty didn't guarantee a fair character. Marriage didn't end economic exposure. Survival could depend on calculation rather than moral reward. Her book, therefore, writes back in two directions. It answers individual employers who controlled the story of her conduct, and it answers a culture that preferred servants as supporting characters. The former servant becomes the central intelligence. She explains what the powerful arrangement looked like from below. She doesn't need access to a grand secret room. The secret is embedded in ordinary procedures. A door closes during a lesson. A prospective place disappears after a character inquiry. A deduction shrinks wages. A child is denied space in employment housing. Nothing here requires melodrama. The mechanism is dramatic because the consequences compound. It would be satisfying to end Mary Ann's story with publication as complete victory. The book survives. We are hearing her. But print didn't erase hardship, and surviving copies don't tell us how many contemporary readers believed her. An archive can rescue a voice from oblivion without repairing the life described. Recognition arrived unevenly and late. Modern scholars had to recover the book from that uneven history. Their work adds context, but it also creates another frame around Mary Ann's voice. An excerpt selected for an anthology may emphasize abuse. A labor historian may emphasize wages and character. A literary scholar may emphasize the servant writing back. Each frame reveals and narrows. That is why the complete life matters. Mary Ann's authority doesn't depend on being a perfect example of victimhood. She was a strategist. She left places, learned skills, formed households, pursued a pension, remarried, protected children, and published. Some attempts failed. Failure didn't remove agency. Agency didn't remove constraint. Holding both truths prevents the past from becoming a contest between misery and inspiration. The memoir contains decisions made inside limited options. Its achievement is not that Mary Ann escaped dependence forever. It is that she documented its changing forms. That delay should alter the way we use the word hidden. Mary Ann's testimony wasn't entirely concealed. She put it in public. The culture failed to keep it central. Some voices are hidden because no page survives. Others are hidden in catalogs, specialist editions, or books that slipped from ordinary reading. Silence can be produced after publication. The distinction will matter even more with Hannah Cullwick. She wrote an extraordinary quantity, but volume alone didn't give her unmediated control. Her diaries were preserved inside the archive of Arthur Munby, the educated man who read them and shaped the relationship around them. Hannah's ink is undeniably hers. The conditions around it are complicated. By the time we return to her, the question has changed. William showed a servant making private room through daily practice. Mary Ann used print to collect 13 workplaces under her own name. Hannah will test whether writing can be both self-possession and performance for another person. The answer sits in the very object promised at the beginning. 79 folded sheets, gray card, 2 cheap treasury tags, black ink packed across the page without gaps. The book looks fragile. What it contains is immense. Hannah Cullwick was born in Shifnal, Shropshire, in 1833. Her working life began young. By adulthood, service had trained her body through repetition long before scholars began asking what her writing meant. She met Arthur Munby in 1854. He was educated, middle class, and employed as a civil servant. He had an intense interest in women, whose labor marked their hands and bodies. Hannah was a domestic servant. Their encounter developed into a private relationship that lasted for decades. Affection, class difference, erotic role play, work, and authority became entangled. Reducing that relationship to romance would hide the imbalance. Reducing Hannah to a passive object would hide her choices. Both errors are tempting. Munby encouraged her to write and send diaries. The pages kept them connected when work and convention limited meetings. He wanted details of her labor. Hannah recorded boots, floors, dishes, washing, money, movement, fatigue, and the sequence of ordinary days. She also recorded herself recording. That second layer matters. When Hannah noted the conditions under which she wrote, we see authorship happening inside service. The pen wasn't floating above work. It was taken up after hands had cleaned, carried, scrubbed, and prepared. At first glance, the lists can appear monotonous. A reader expecting dramatic confession may hurry past repeated tasks. But repetition is evidence. Domestic labor was designed to disappear into restored order. A polished surface doesn't display the number of motions that made it shine. When Hannah lists the motions, day after day, disappearance becomes quantity. The diary refuses the finished room's lie. Cleanliness isn't a natural condition of a respectable house. It is an achievement repeatedly purchased from a worker's body. One room can demonstrate the effect. A grate is black before it is cleaned, and black again after another day of use. Ash settles. Boots return with mud. Water has to be carried, heated, used, and removed. The worker doesn't complete cleanliness once. She restores it against a household that keeps living. The diary's recurring verbs therefore create movement rather than stasis. Washing follows making fires. Carrying follows washing. Cooking produces dishes. People entering the house create more sweeping, fetching, and answering. Hannah's day was an interlocking chain. If one task ran late, another didn't disappear. Delay accumulated in the same body. A list preserves that pressure better than an isolated dramatic anecdote. It also reveals judgment through order. What appears first? Which task receives a measure? What causes Hannah to pause? Even plain accounting contains emphasis. Readers sometimes treat domestic detail as background because the outcome is familiar. We know the room will be cleaned. Hannah makes us wait through the work. The time is the fact. This doesn't mean Hannah described work only as oppression. She took pride in strength, endurance, and skill. Her relation to labor wasn't simple. Modern readers may want liberation to mean leaving service and adopting middle-class ease. Hannah often resisted that model. She valued her identity as a working woman. She didn't consistently accept Munby's desire that she become a lady. That refusal can look paradoxical if work is understood only as something done to her. For Hannah, capacity itself carried value. Her hands proved competence. Yet pride in labor didn't make the employment system equal. A worker can value skill while another person profits from it. Hannah's self-definition existed within limits, shaped by wages, gender, class, and the man who read her pages. The diaries therefore demand two readings at once. They are authentic compositions by Hannah. They are also communications, written with Munby as a known audience. He prompted and preserved them. Their private vocabulary emerged inside a relationship whose power cannot be ignored. An audience doesn't cancel authorship. Every diary imagines someone, even when that someone is a future self. Hannah's case makes the listener unusually visible. She knew who would receive the pages. She could satisfy, resist, tease, explain, withhold, or reshape what that reader expected. That range is where agency lives. If we treat Munby's influence as total, Hannah vanishes again. If we treat the pages as untouched self-expression, the conditions of their making vanish. The useful question isn't whether the text is pure. No text is. The question is what Hannah did within the relation that carried her writing forward. Writing at Hannah's scale required a hidden material economy. Paper had to be obtained and kept dry. Ink had to remain usable. A pen needed trimming or replacement. Light had to last beyond paid duty. None of these conditions was extraordinary alone. Together, repeated across years, they became an achievement. A household servant rarely enjoyed an office with a closing door. She wrote inside space controlled by other people's routines. Interruption was always possible. This gives the physical manuscript a second meaning. Dense writing conserved paper, but it also made each available period productive. Hannah didn't wait for ideal conditions. The page accepted fragments, lists, and longer reflections, according to what the day allowed. Form followed opportunity. That is one reason spelling or grammar should never be treated as a measure of intelligence here. Standard written English was a trained convention. Hannah's command of sequence, detail, and self-presentation can be powerful even when a sentence doesn't match an elite classroom. To correct every irregularity before hearing the voice would mistake polish for thought. Her surviving manuscripts give us unusual room to examine the answer. The archive at Trinity College, Cambridge, holds diaries dated from 1854 to 1873. They occupy one archival box within the Munby papers. That placement is part of the survival story. Hannah's words reached the institution through material connected to Munby. His archive became the door through which her diary entered a catalog. The result is both rescue and framing. Without preservation, the pages might have disappeared. Because of the preservation, readers must encounter them inside a collection named for the man whose life intersected with hers. The archive isn't neutral storage. It records the path by which objects arrived. One object makes that path almost touchable. It is the diary from 1863, the fragile book promised near the beginning. The original was small. It consisted of 79 folded sheets of ivory letter paper. Poor grayish card wrapped them. 2 treasury tags had been pushed through the spine margins to hold the bundle together. Black ink covered the leaves. There were no generous spaces, illustrations, or neat pauses. The writing continued without gaps or paragraphs. Every available area carried work. The object recorded Hannah's activity across the year. Its rough assembly doesn't resemble a luxury volume purchased to ornament a library. It resembles a tool made adequate by use. The 2 tags eventually damaged the very pages they held. Holes wore open. Some tears reached the edges. Old repairs had used gummed paper cut from the margins of postage stamp sheets. That detail is beautiful because it is practical. Somebody had taken a scrap meant to be discarded and used it to keep the diary alive. Preservation had begun before professional conservation. By the time the manuscript reached a conservator's bench in the early 21st century, its original fastening was no longer safe. The treasury tags were removed. Surface dirt was lifted carefully. Tears and losses were repaired with Japanese paper and wheat starch paste. The leaves received new support. Conservation is slow because every repair changes an original object. A stronger binding can protect pages while hiding evidence of how the writer used them. The chosen treatment had to respect both needs. The old card remained part of the volume. The damaged tags and earlier repairs stayed with it. Readers can therefore distinguish Hannah's working object from the modern structure built around it. That distinction mirrors the editorial task. Support should make access possible without pretending to be original. Any visual reconstruction should follow the same ethics. A reconstructed diary can show size, density, gray card, and fastening. It must not masquerade as the manuscript itself. The surviving object remains the evidence. The image is an interpretation. A limp vellum binding protected the text while allowing it to open. The remains of the old card, tags, and stamp paper repairs were retained with the manuscript in a custom box. Conservation did not erase the rough history. It made the history readable without letting further reading destroy it. The promised object now gives its answer. What could a servant keep when a household controlled her time? Hannah kept a sequence. She turned daily labor into accumulated testimony. The cheap tags could fail. The ink could outlast them. Yet the object also answers the harder part. Keeping isn't one action completed by the writer. It is a chain. Hannah produced the text. Someone preserved the bundle. Munby's papers carried it into an institutional future. Archivists described it. Conservators stabilized it. Editors selected from it. Scholars argued over it. Readers now decide what kind of voice they think they hear. Every link changes access. Access has another cost. The reader enters a private relationship whose participants didn't design it for a modern audience. Munby's papers were kept closed for years after his death. When they became available, intimate material moved from secrecy into scholarship. The legal ability to read isn't the same as an ethical license to sensationalize. Hannah's dignity depends on retaining proportion. Her unusual relationship mattered, but it did not consume every day. The diary gives far more space to work than a scandal-seeking summary usually does. If we lift only the most startling passage, we repeat the grand house's visual logic. We make the servant appear when spectacle requires her, and disappear during labor. The archive asks for patience. It asks us to read enough repetition to understand what the exceptional moment interrupted. That principle also protects truth. A phrase taken from private role play can be mistaken for an ordinary employment rule. A costume made for a photograph can be mistaken for daily dress. Context separates evidence types. Hannah's diary entry tells us what she wrote that day. Munby's diary may tell us how he reacted. A photograph records a posed encounter with a camera. None can silently substitute for the others. The manuscript itself disciplines interpretation. Its density shows the cost of composition. There is no wide blank margin inviting us to imagine leisure. The writing fits into material scarcity. But density also shows decision. Hannah returned to the act across years. Munby's prompting may explain the original invitation. It doesn't move the pen across millions of words. That labor was hers. The scale complicates a common story about working-class silence. Hannah wasn't silent on paper. The problem was that most people never saw the pages. Private abundance and public invisibility can exist together. That is why Hannah's Places deserves special attention. It isn't merely another daily list. It is a retrospective account of the households where she had worked. The form required selection and order. On the 2nd of July in 1872, Hannah completed her chores, cleaned herself, and wrote the account in one sustained session. She then posted it. Recent scholarship emphasizes the deliberate shape of this act. Hannah wasn't simply responding line by line to a questionnaire, while Munby hovered over the page. She gathered her employment history and carried it toward him on her own timetable. The manuscript becomes a route through doors already crossed. Each place had once defined her by current duty. In recollection, she could place the employers beside one another. The servant organized the houses. That reversal resembles Ann Ashford's memoir, but the destination differed. Ann addressed a printed public. Hannah addressed the man inside her secret relationship. The difference affected candor, structure, and survival. A private known reader may invite intimate shorthand. A public reader may require explanation. Neither audience is automatically freer. Public print exposes a writer to judgment and market failure. Private exchange gives one person extraordinary influence over the continued conversation. Hannah's writing moved within that tension. The timing of Hannah's Places adds another layer. She and Munby married secretly in January of 1873. The account was written before the marriage, although a later archival note attached to the material described it as written after. That discrepancy matters. It shows how a later label can change the apparent relation between text and event. A reader relying only on the note might interpret the account as a wife's recollection prepared for her husband. The diary entry anchors it earlier. She was still moving toward the decision. Historical truth often turns on details this small. A date doesn't merely decorate the story. It changes who Hannah was when she sealed the pages. Munby and Hannah married at a church in Clerkenwell under special license. The marriage remained hidden from most people around them. Class made public acknowledgement difficult. He belonged to a world in which marriage to a servant could threaten standing. She didn't simply dissolve into his class after the ceremony. Hannah retained her own name and her attachment to working identity. Their domestic arrangement could blur wife and servant in ways that modern readers find disturbing. Intimate role-play drew upon the language and hierarchies of empire, gender, and class. We shouldn't romanticize it, nor should we imagine that a label solves it. Hannah made choices within an unequal relationship. Munby exercised influence within a relationship he couldn't make socially equal. The diaries preserve negotiation rather than a clean verdict. Marriage did not solve the social contradiction. Publicly recognizing Hannah as wife would have exposed Munby's private life to a class world he had kept separate. Secrecy protected him in ways it didn't protect her. At the same time, Hannah resisted being remade according to respectable expectations. The position of lady could offer comfort and acknowledgement. It could also require her to disown the working identity through which she understood strength. She didn't accept that exchange neatly. This is not proof that every choice was free. A choice can express conviction and still be shaped by unequal options. Hannah's decisions emerged from attachment, pride, habit, desire, and constraint. The page lets those forces remain unresolved. That is more honest than translating her into modern slogans. She wasn't waiting for us to rescue her into an identity she never claimed. She was writing the self she knew. This is where authentic voice becomes more demanding than a quotation on screen. A sentence can be Hannah's and still need context about why she wrote it. A photograph can show her and still need context about who arranged it. Evidence isn't self-interpreting. The ethical task is to avoid turning intimate material into spectacle while also refusing to conceal the forces visible inside it. Hannah's relationship with dirt, labor, bodily display, and Munby's desires has attracted intense scholarly attention. Those subjects are real. They can also overwhelm the simpler fact that she was a formidable writer of daily experience. When attention fixes only on the unusual relationship, the domestic labor becomes scenery again. Hannah's lists resist that outcome. Each boot, floor, dish, and errand returns the body to time. The repeated entries ask how many hours were consumed by comfort that belonged to someone else. They also ask what pride can mean when attached to exhausting work. Pride can defend dignity. It can help a person endure. It can be encouraged by someone who benefits from the endurance. All three can be true. That is why Hannah cannot be made into a simple emblem of either submission or rebellion. Her power appears in form. She chooses what to mention, how to sequence it, when to post it, and how to name her past. Her constraint appears around the form. Time is scarce. The reader is known. The archive is routed through him. The page holds both. At the start, Hannah's evening seemed like a private victory after chores. It still is. Now it is more than that. The washed dishes, the washed body, the sustained writing, the walk or dispatch to the post, and the return to bed form an event chain. Domestic work doesn't merely precede authorship. It sets the clock against which authorship happens. If she delays, sleep shrinks. If the household calls, the page waits. If fatigue wins, memory remains unwritten. That night, the page won. The post matters as much as the writing. A completed manuscript can remain on a table. Hannah sent hers out. The movement gave the text a destination beyond the room in which fatigue might have stopped it. Postal systems often appear in history as infrastructure for merchants, officials, and lovers. Here the post carried a servant's employment history. It connected the private hour to an archive not yet imagined. The packet may have looked ordinary among thousands. Its future importance wasn't visible on the outside. That invisibility is encouraging and unsettling. Encouraging because historical value can travel in unremarkable covers. Unsettling because nobody knows how many comparable packets were lost. Hannah's surviving record cannot tell us the scale of disappearance. It can show what disappearance would have cost. The victory was partial because Munby remained its first destination. Yet partial control isn't no control. Hannah selected the account that left her hand. The distinction will guide us into another diary, one that survived not because a secret husband collected it, but because a famous son later used it. Sarah Wells's pages traveled through family memory. Her name is less immediately recognizable than her son's. He wrote The Time Machine and the War of the Worlds. Before he imagined futures, Herbert George Wells studied his mother's past. Sarah's diary gave him access to the young woman who existed before he was born. It also preserved the day a great house closed its door on her. That dismissal did more than end a position. It pushed her son toward the future for which the world remembers him. Sarah Neal began her diary in 1845, when she was in her early 20s. She was working as a lady's maid for the wife of Captain Ford and traveling through Ireland and England. The early pages delighted the son who read them decades later. Herbert George Wells found descriptions of scenery, emotional reflections, and the voice of an interested young woman. She had a life before she became his mother. That simple fact is one of the diary's gifts. Famous children can flatten their parents into origins. A mother's childhood, ambition, grief, and desire disappear behind the role she performed after they arrived. Sarah's ink resists that flattening. In Ireland, she looked from the railway towards sea and mountains. The landscape opened a private sorrow. She remembered a lover she believed had treated her heart carelessly. The passage is conventional and raw at once. Sarah used the romantic language available to her. That doesn't make the pain borrowed. Literary phrases helped her contain an experience she couldn't safely discuss with everyone around her. She later recorded burning the man's letters. The letters vanished. Her account of destroying them remained. This is an archive, built around absence. We don't know what he wrote. We don't hear his defense or apology. Sarah's diary preserves the act by which she tried to reduce his power over memory. Fire erased one side of the exchange. Ink preserved the person who chose the fire. Her writing also records loneliness, without making it her only condition. She met kindness. She traveled. She observed places with energy and brought familiar moral language to uncertainty. The page could hold contradiction without resolving it. In 1850, Sarah entered service at Uppark in West Sussex. The house stood high on the South Downs and carried the weight of a long elite history. For Sarah, it was a workplace. She became lady's maid to Frances Bullock, who lived there with her sister. The position required proximity to a woman of rank without equality. A lady's maid cared for dress, hair, personal belongings, travel, and the private routines hidden from visitors. She occupied a trusted place near the body. The work required discretion as much as technique. Clothing carried social information. Damage had to be repaired before it became visible. Travel demanded planning for another person's comfort. The maid was expected to know preferences without making her knowledge conspicuous. That position gave Sarah access to conversations and moods unavailable to lower servants. It didn't give her ownership of what she handled. Proximity could feel like belonging until a decision proved otherwise. That intimacy could confer status among servants. It could also make the worker's day dependent on one person's movements and moods. Sarah's diary gives Uppark an interior voice different from its grand rooms. The house itself had been arranged to control visibility. A formal entrance led visitors toward decorated interiors. Service routes allowed work to move on another line. The famous baize door marked a change in social atmosphere as surely as a wall. On one side, a guest encountered display. On the other, servants received instructions, stored equipment, and coordinated the labor that kept display intact. Sarah's diary can cross that architectural divide because she worked on both sides of responsibility. As a lady's maid, she carried one woman's private needs. As housekeeper, she later managed a much broader domestic machine. The page connects rooms the architecture tried to separate. She noted that the house did little at Christmas except eat. The remark is short and dry. It compresses an entire festival of preparation into the perspective of someone inside the work. Then a gardener arrived. His name was Joseph Wells. Sarah's first surviving judgment was wonderfully spare. He seemed peculiar. She added nothing. That tiny sentence gained comedy because her son knew what followed. The peculiar gardener would become Sarah's husband and his father. The line doesn't predict love. It preserves first uncertainty. Herbert later imagined that they may have met in the servants' hall, where dances were held with a concertina and fiddle. "We need to keep his grammar intact," he said probably. The diary confirms Sarah's reaction to Joseph. It doesn't place their first conversation in a fully documented scene. That boundary prevents a charming image from becoming false memory. Sarah left Uppark when her mother became seriously ill. In 1853, both parents died within months. She married Joseph soon after. Her diary is strangely quiet about the decision. Herbert searched it for an engagement and found none. He guessed at motives, then admitted he was guessing. Silence inside a diary can be intentional or accidental. Sarah may have considered an engagement too private. She may have expected the future to make it obvious. Pages may be missing, or the courtship may have unfolded through speech that never needed written explanation. We cannot choose among those possibilities. The gap is still evidence. It warns us that a detailed diary is not a complete transcript of life. Writers select even when they write for themselves. The absence also saves Sarah from being reduced to romance. Her marriage changed her path, but the diary's quietness refuses the neat scene a biographer might want. The son had access to the document, not to his mother's whole mind. That limitation makes his autobiography unusually revealing. He sometimes separates evidence from speculation. At other moments, his judgments about Sarah are severe. The diary passes through a son's affection and impatience. Sarah and Joseph had a brief period of happiness in a gardener's cottage at Shuckburgh Park. Her writing calls the home happy, even while noting work she disliked. Then Joseph received warning to leave. Sarah underlined the entry repeatedly. She looked at her baby and understood that dismissal would remove the pretty home as well as the wage. The old service mechanism returned. Employment, housing, and family security collapsed together. They moved into a crockery shop in Bromley called Atlas House. The name suggested a world carried on strong shoulders. Inside, the business barely supported them. Sarah's diary registered fear almost at once. There wasn't enough furniture or capital. Customers failed to appear. She wished she had taken another position. The household had escaped service and entered a different dependence. Joseph found more pleasure and income in cricket than in the shop. Sarah carried domestic work, children, anxiety, and much of the daily struggle to keep the place functioning. The style of her diary changed. The young lady's maid, who had described scenery and heartbreak, began recording dates, illness, movements, and disappointment in thinner lines. Fatigue altered form. This is not a story of literacy gained and then securely possessed. Sarah never lost the ability to write. She lost spaciousness. The early diary could wander across a landscape. The later one became compressed by Atlas House. Daily pressure didn't silence her completely. It reduced the kind of attention she could afford. The change is visible because one diary spans both conditions. We don't have to compare two different women and guess why their styles differed. The same writer becomes briefer. That continuity turns literary form into social evidence. Long description requires more than vocabulary. It requires a mind with enough unclaimed space to notice, arrange, and linger. Atlas House consumed that space. Sarah often reached the diary after the day's needs had been met. The remaining line could be a fragment of self-possession. When the fragments grew thinner, the household was entering the page by crowding it. Silence, in this sense, has a texture. It may not look like an empty book. It may look like a record reduced to dates and comings and goings. The voice survives, but its range contracts. Herbert recognized the deterioration, although his account contains the blindness of a son looking backward. He could see that his mother was overwhelmed. He still judged her capabilities harshly. He described Sarah as trained for defined duties and poorly equipped to improvise outside them. The language tells us as much about his theory of character as it does about her. Sarah had, after all, kept a failing household alive for years. She raised children, endured bereavement, worked and wrote. A person can be bad at accounts or cooking without lacking intelligence. Herbert's fame doesn't make every verdict final. This is the distinctive problem of Sarah's surviving voice. We often hear it because her son quotes it. His book is the convenient route into her diary. The route has a guide who never stops interpreting. Unlike Hannah's known audience at the moment of composition, Herbert became Sarah's audience later. She didn't write most entries for the future novelist who would publish selections. He grew into the role of editor. His memory, humor, guilt, and need to explain himself shaped which lines became public. The diary helped him construct an origin story. One childhood accident became central to that story. Herbert broke his leg when he was young. Forced into stillness, he encountered books and pictures with new intensity. He later believed the break changed his destiny. Uppark expanded the change. Sarah returned there in 1880 as housekeeper, and her son sometimes stayed with her. The great house contained a library. Her employment gave him access to it. The library was not Sarah's private study. She entered Uppark through employment and brought her son into the margin of that access. He read books accumulated by wealth he didn't possess. Country houses often present libraries as monuments to owners. Their intellectual afterlives also belong to readers who arrived by less obvious routes. A servant dusted the shelves. A child of the house studied there. A housekeeper's son found a possible future. The same room contained different relationships to knowledge. This doesn't mean Uppark single-handedly made Herbert a writer. He studied, taught, struggled, and pursued opportunities elsewhere. It supplied conditions at decisive intervals. Sarah's labor formed part of those conditions. The child of a struggling shopkeeper could read within the architecture of wealth because his mother managed the household behind it. Books were another form of stored power. A library accumulated money, inheritance, education, and leisure across generations. Herbert entered that accumulated advantage temporarily. He could not inherit the estate, but he could carry ideas away. Reading makes ownership porous. The volume stays on the shelf, while its contents move into a mind the collector never anticipated. Sarah's position made that transfer possible. This is a quieter reversal than Mary Ann's publication. Mary Ann sent a servant's account into public print. Sarah brought a servant's son into private print already gathered. Both routes changed who could use the written word. That access didn't erase class difference. It made class difference educational. Herbert saw how the estate was organized. Uppark later informed his fictional Bladesover, a country house used to examine English hierarchy. The servant's son turned the employer's space into material. Sarah's diary had already performed a similar reversal in miniature. Uppark was not merely an inheritance or architectural treasure. It was where a young maid met a peculiar gardener, and where an older housekeeper tried to control expenditure. Her 2 periods there framed a lifetime. As housekeeper, Sarah occupied the senior female office among the servants. She wore authority and answered for the internal economy. The role brought security the Wells family badly needed. It also exposed her to demands she wasn't always able to meet. Saving became a repeated command. Sarah believed excessive pinching could violate the dignity expected of a country house. That disagreement sounds almost comic. The servant defended grandeur against the owner. It reveals the strange position of a housekeeper. She had to maintain the appearance of abundance while obeying instructions to reduce its cost. Success remained invisible. The office also separated Sarah from the simple fellowship implied by the servants' hall. She had to supervise people whose dependence resembled her own. Orders traveled downward through her. Complaints traveled upward with her name attached. A housekeeper could be blamed from both directions. Junior servants might resent economy. Employers might suspect waste. The role offered authority without final control. Sarah had keys, but not tenure. Keys themselves were evidence of trust and burden. They represented access to stores, linen, and spaces that required accounting. Losing the office meant surrendering that material authority. The same metal object could mark status one week and absence the next. Herbert's account doesn't need to describe the handover for us to understand the mechanism. Notice ended the permission. That sentence captures the threshold. A key opens a door for the person trusted today. It cannot prevent tomorrow's notice. If guests saw smooth hospitality, the house seemed naturally well run. If bills rose or gossip escaped, the housekeeper became visible as a problem. Sarah's deafness increased. Herbert believed her efficiency declined. She also repeated stories about the women of the house that reached their ears. His account suggests the gossip helped seal her fate. The language must remain his assessment. We have the outcome more securely than every cause. In January of 1893, Sarah received 1 month's notice. The phrase transformed 13 years of authority into a countdown. She had managed rooms, servants, stores, guests, and expense. Now the house reduced her future to weeks. On the 16th of February, she left Uppark with her boxes. Herbert wrote that she was driven to Petersfield Station. He then created a vivid image of a stunned little woman in black, looking back toward the hill with tears in her blue eyes. It is an unforgettable scene. It is also explicitly imagined. He wasn't presenting a witnessed report. He wrote that he could imagine her. The distinction belongs in the story because visual certainty is seductive. Once a writer supplies the bonnet, platform, road, and tiers, the scene feels archival. It isn't. The documented frame is enough. It includes the boxes. Objects give dismissal its weight because they show residence becoming luggage. The possessions that had occupied a settled room had to be counted, closed, carried, and placed on transport. Sarah's authority over household stores ended. Her own things became the household she could take. The boxes carry the human consequence without invented tiers. The boxes are supported by the account. They can stand for transition without pretending we know her face at the station. Sarah left with her possessions on that date. The great house ceased to be refuge for her and the family. Her emotional state is likely to have been shaken, but the exact image belongs to her son's later reconstruction. We can honor the loss without pretending to stand beside her. The 1 month's notice carries more than shock. It summarizes the conditional nature of service, even at senior level. Years of responsibility didn't create a permanent right to stay. The housekeeper controlled many doors until one was closed against her. That closure changed Herbert's role. By then, he was 26, married, scientifically educated, teaching, and beginning to publish. He could arrange shelter for his mother. The dependent child had become a son capable of support. He also understood that the years at Uppark had helped him reach that position. Sarah's employment provided intervals of relief, books, space, and opportunity. Her dismissal occurred just as his own writing life was taking shape. The future author rose from conditions partly secured by the servant mother. That does not make her suffering a necessary sacrifice in a comforting design. History isn't obliged to justify harm by pointing at a famous result. Sarah deserved security, whether Herbert became a novelist or not. Still, causation matters. The job that ended with 1 month's notice had opened a library door for him. The son who would imagine time travel carried a servant's archive into his autobiography. Sarah died in 1905. Her diary outlived her. Herbert published Experiment in Autobiography in the 1930s and used the document extensively. By then, the private record had become evidence in a public account of genius, family, class, and chance. Sarah's words gained reach through his name. They also became vulnerable to being read only for what they explain about him. We can reverse the lens. The entry about the peculiar gardener is not valuable merely because it foreshadows Herbert's birth. It is Sarah's compact judgment at a moment when Joseph had no claim on her future. The burned letters aren't valuable merely as background to her marriage. They show a young woman deciding how to handle betrayal. The narrowing diary at Atlas House isn't merely evidence of the environment that formed a writer. It is the trace of attention under strain. Storm. The Uppark entries aren't only material for a famous novel. They preserve the work of maintaining a country house from a position between authority and dependence. This reversal gives Sarah back the center. Her diary's survival still owes much to family connection. A famous son had reason and resources to preserve, read, and publish from it. Many mothers' notebooks never received that passage. Fame is another archival filter. It decides which ordinary lives become relevant because they touch an extraordinary name. Sarah doesn't need that borrowed importance. Her own record joins the larger argument. A servant's voice may survive because the writer practices daily, self-publishes, sends pages to a secret partner, or gives birth to someone whose archive will be kept. None of those routes is neutral. Each selects. William's weak handwriting became durable because he persisted, and editors later cared. Marianne's public book nearly disappeared from ordinary reading. Hannah's vast private record entered Trinity through Munby. Sarah's diary reached us through Herbert. The surviving voices are not a representative sample of all servants. They are the people whose words found carriers. Carriers can be loving and distorting at the same time. Herbert cared about Sarah enough to preserve her presence across many pages. He also used her to explain limitations he believed he had escaped. His account sometimes turns her into a tragic type. The diary interrupts him. It offers the young traveler, the wounded lover, the amused observer, the anxious shopkeeper's wife, and the senior servant. No single judgment contains them all. Reading mother beside son becomes a method. When Herbert says he imagines, we keep the scene as imagination. When he quotes a dated entry, we treat the words as Sarah's surviving record. When he offers a cause, we ask whether he witnessed it or inferred it later. The separation doesn't diminish his book. It lets both writers remain visible. That realization brings us to the last record. It is the most unstable and perhaps the most revealing. The title names a charwoman called Elizabeth Dobbs. Research suggests That wasn't her legal name. The life probably belonged to Martha Grimes, a woman who moved through service, performance, lodging work, shoemaking, and cleaning. She couldn't write the autobiography herself. Another woman held the pen. If Sarah's famous son framed a diary after the fact, Elizabeth's recorder shaped the words at the moment they became text. The door between voice and page was no longer metaphorical. It sat at a table between two women. The book appeared in 1900 under the title The Autobiography of a Charwoman, as chronicled by Annie Wakeman. Even the grammar divides ownership. Autobiography promises a self-written life. Chronicled by announces another hand. The woman inside the narrative is called Elizabeth Dobbs, often Betty. Modern research suggests she was probably Martha Grimes, born in 1843. That identification is persuasive, not absolute. We will keep both names visible. Elizabeth Dobbs belongs to the printed text. Martha Grimes belongs to the probable historical life, reconstructed from records. Collapsing them without warning would hide the uncertainty that makes this document valuable. The printed Elizabeth says she received only about 2 irregular years of schooling. She couldn't read or write, yet she had a life worth recording. Annie Wakeman, an American woman who employed her, became the person who listened and put the account into prose. We don't know every practical detail of their sessions. The exact room, hour, number of meetings, and rhythm of dictation cannot be confidently reconstructed from the evidence at hand. We shouldn't stage certainty where none survives. What we can see is a relationship of narration. One woman supplied remembered experience. The other selected words, punctuation, sequence, and a form that a publisher would accept. The speaking voice crossed the table. Ink appeared under someone else's fingers. That process makes the book neither simple fiction nor untouched testimony. It is a collaboration under unequal conditions. Elizabeth controlled what she chose to tell. Annie controlled much of how telling became text. Each woman may have had reasons to alter names, chronology, or sensitive facts. Their reasons need not have been the same. Elizabeth might protect herself, a child, a former partner, or a reputation. Annie might protect living people, satisfy readers, impose narrative order, or soften material that crossed class expectations. The printed page doesn't label each intervention. That uncertainty is not a reason to throw the book away. It is the reason to read it with 2 lines of sight. One follows the working woman's remembered life. The other follows the hand that made that life legible to the market. The first line is difficult enough. Elizabeth described a chaotic childhood, instability, and very little formal education. The probable Martha Grimes appears in census and civil records that overlap with important parts of the narrative. Names, ages, family structures, and places create a pattern strong enough for identification. The pattern is not perfect. Some dates move. Some relationships differ. Events may be combined. The book's Elizabeth and the documented Martha don't align like transparent sheets. They resemble 2 maps drawn for different journeys. The archive map asks where a person lived, whom she married, and which children were registered. The memoir map asks what she believed made her life coherent. A conflict between them can expose concealment, error, or literary shaping. It can also expose the limits of official records. A census is not a recording of the heart. It may contain a clerk's spelling, a landlord's answer, a strategic claim of respectability, or a person temporarily absent. Official doesn't mean omniscient. Likewise, oral testimony doesn't mean exact. Memory reorganizes. Shame omits. Pride revises. A listener misunderstands. A writer improves a sentence until the speaker's cadence becomes harder to find. Truth must be assembled across sources. Assembly should not be confused with prosecution. The memoir isn't on trial before the census. Each source answers different questions and carries different errors. Civil registration can confirm a birth or marriage recorded under a legal name. It cannot explain why a narrator chose an alias. A census can place a household on one night. It cannot capture years of movement between the enumerations. The book can supply motive and feeling. It may compress chronology to make them intelligible. The best account lets sources correct one another without demanding that one source do every job. Elizabeth's occupational sequence gives that assembly a strong spine. She worked in domestic service. She also performed as a singer. At other points, she kept a boarding house and assisted in shoemaking. After family reverses, she worked as a charwoman. The route matters because charring was not the same as living in. A charwoman usually entered houses for cleaning and left again. She might serve several households without belonging fully to any staff. The front door changed function. For William, it separated a live-in footman from wife and child. For Mary Ann, it led from one place to another under the shadow of a character. For Hannah, it enclosed long days whose sequence she wrote after work. For Sarah, it opened into senior authority and then closed after 1 month's notice. For the charwoman, it opened repeatedly and temporarily. She crossed into private rooms without receiving a lasting room of her own. This form of labor could provide flexibility. It could also produce insecurity. Hours, customers, health, and reputation determined income. The worker carried her body and tools between other people's spaces. No single employer necessarily saw the whole economy. Chairing also altered how employers could describe attachment. A resident servant might be praised as part of the household. A woman arriving by the day remained visibly contractual. She was present for the dirt and absent from the family photograph. The arrangement could protect some independence, because no single house owned every hour. It could also leave gaps no house accepted responsibility for filling. Sickness meant lost visits. Age reduced speed. Travel between jobs consumed unpaid time. A broken brush or wet day could matter in a budget built from small payments. This distributed insecurity rarely leaves one complete employer record. The worker's own life story is what connects it. That fragmentation resembles the archive. One household remembers a woman cleaning. Another knows her as a singer. A census records a boarding house. A marriage record fixes a surname. The autobiography gathers the fragments into one moving self. But whose self is it? The title's Elizabeth may be a protective mask. Martha may be the person beneath. Annie's prose may preserve speech rhythms in one passage and replace them with literary convention in another. We cannot divide the sentences by touch. The page contains blended labor. That phrase is usually applied to manufacture, but it fits collaborative memory. Elizabeth contributes experience and telling. Annie contributes listening, inscription, arrangement, and access to print. The publisher contributes a title, object, distribution, and audience. No contribution is equal in kind. The charwoman's life is the reason the book exists, yet the people controlling paper can decide how that reason is presented. This makes Annie neither savior nor thief by definition. Without her, Elizabeth's extended account may never have reached print. Through her, parts of Elizabeth may have been changed. Preservation and distortion can occur in the same gesture. Sarah's son had shown us that already. Herbert quoted his mother and judged her. Munby preserved Hannah's papers while shaping the intimate audience for which she wrote. Annie makes mediation impossible to ignore because the narrator could not inspect the written page independently. She couldn't compare her spoken phrase with the printed sentence. That is the sharpest asymmetry in this record. A literate collaborator can revise and ask approval. An illiterate speaker has to trust sound, memory, and the reader's honesty. If a page is read back, intonation may still conceal punctuation or omission. The object remains controlled by someone else. Yet, illiteracy does not make Elizabeth voiceless. That assumption would confuse writing with thought. She could remember, judge, joke, select, refuse, exaggerate, and tell. Oral culture carries extraordinary precision. Songs, sayings, family histories, and work techniques move without private books. The problem is not whether speech has value. It is whether institutions preserve it. A manuscript can wait silently on a shelf. A spoken account usually needs a witness in real time. If nobody listens, the words disappear with the air. Annie listened. That fact should be honored without granting her total authorship of the life. The book's occupational breadth also corrects a narrow image of working-class women. Elizabeth wasn't only a cleaner. She adapted across sectors as opportunity and misfortune changed. Singing used performance. Boarding used management. Shoemaking assistants joined household and craft labor. Chairing sold physical endurance by the visit. These shifts demonstrate intelligence through survival. Formal schooling had been brief. Practical education continued everywhere. Every job required new timing, observation, and negotiation. The education system changed during Elizabeth's lifetime. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 created a framework for local school boards in England and Wales. It did not instantly place every child in a classroom. Attendance, fees, local provision, family need, and enforcement changed unevenly. Elizabeth's childhood came before that framework. Her limited schooling shows what the reform had to confront. A child could become a wage earner before literacy became secure. By the time wider provision expanded, adult life had already formed around the absence. You can see why the date matters. History often celebrates an Education Act as a solved problem. A life shows the delay between law and capability. Even a school place doesn't guarantee time to attend. Families needed wages. Girls performed care and household work. Illness, moves, clothing, distance, and fees could interrupt learning. 2 years scattered across childhood were not a foundation strong enough to command print. Elizabeth grew older in a society increasingly filled with forms, notices, advertisements, contracts, newspapers, and records. The written world expanded around someone excluded from writing. Dependence followed. Another person might read a letter, calculate a bill, or state what a document required. Trust became infrastructure. That doesn't mean every helper deceived her. It means the possibility of independent checking was unequal. The autobiography of a charwoman converts that dependence into its subject and its method. The woman who could not control a document became the reason a document was made. The paradox is immediate. She could not write. Her autobiography exists. The title carries the explanation because it says chronicled by Annie Wakeman. That division of labor is more interesting than a vague claim about secret lives. It shows exactly where the secret could be altered. The book was published in London by John McQueen at the end of the Victorian period. It was illustrated and sold as a volume to readers who may have approached Betty Dobbs as a social curiosity. The market introduced another audience. Readers often wanted working-class narrators to be colorful, morally legible, and entertaining. Poverty had to become a story that could be purchased by people outside it. Annie may have shaped the account toward those expectations. Elizabeth may have understood the performance and supplied it strategically. We cannot assign every flourish. We can notice when the text seems designed to make disorder cohere. Autobiography always turns a lived sequence into a plot after the fact. The collaborative form doubles the selection. One person remembers, another arranges, a third institution publishes. The result can preserve material no official archive considered important. It can also make a life more acceptable than it was. Research comparing the narrative with census evidence found revealing differences. The printed story handles an illegitimate birth in a form more compatible with expected melodrama. Records point toward a more complicated paternity and chronology. We don't need to expose private scandal for its own sake. The historical value lies in the change. Somebody altered the difficult fact. It may have been Elizabeth, Annie, or both. The motive might include shame, protection, convention, or salability. Certainty ends there. The discrepancy proves that authentic voice is not identical to literal accuracy in every detail. A person can tell the truth of vulnerability while changing the name or sequence attached to it. A scribe can preserve a structure of suffering while rewriting the event that produced it. Historians must hold empathy and verification together. Empathy without testing can spread error. Testing without empathy can turn a vulnerable life into a list of corrections. The goal is not to catch Elizabeth lying. It is to understand what conditions made disguise useful. Respectability had material consequences. A woman's sexual history could affect employment, housing, family relations, and how readers judged every later claim. An alias might protect more than pride. It might keep a living network from being recognized. Annie, as employer and chronicler, occupied a mixed position. She knew Elizabeth through paid work. The cleaner entered her household under an economic relation before becoming narrative partner. That origin could encourage intimacy. It could also make refusal difficult. Did Elizabeth feel free to stop? Did she choose every topic? Did Annie ask leading questions? The available evidence does not let us answer confidently. Those questions belong in the record precisely because the book's smooth prose can make collaboration disappear. The title restores it. As chronicled by is a small disclosure of method. It doesn't tell us enough, but it prevents us from crediting the physical writing to Elizabeth. That honesty is uncommon in a genre eager to present one coherent author. It also offers a model for reading other servant voices. Ask who held the pen. Ask who expected to read. Ask who kept the object. Ask what another source changes. Those questions don't drain emotion from a story. They put emotion on firmer ground. Elizabeth's long path through work becomes more moving when it isn't used as a fable. She did not climb a neat ladder from hardship to comfort. She moved, adapted, lost ground, and sold labor in changing forms. Chairing came after reverses. The final occupation could look like descent from the boarding house or stage. It also showed a refusal to disappear. She kept earning. Then she performed another kind of work by telling. Oral narration takes energy. It requires returning to injuries, choosing sequence, explaining vanished customs, and making private memory intelligible to someone with a different class experience. The speaker monitors the listener. Confusion has to be repaired. Shame may be approached indirectly. Humor can make a difficult truth bearable. Annie's questions may have shaped the route, but Elizabeth still had to travel it. Calling the finished book merely Annie's would repeat the inequality of literacy. Calling it merely Elizabeth's would conceal the recorder's power. Collaboration is the only truthful noun. The noun remains uncomfortable because collaboration can suggest equality. This one wasn't equal. Perhaps we need a longer phrase. An unequally mediated collaboration. The words aren't elegant. The situation wasn't either. That phrase lets preservation and power remain in the same frame. It also returns us to every preceding voice. William's diary seems direct, yet editors chose a title and selections for publication. Mary Ann authored a printed memoir, yet memory and the press stood between event and reader. Hannah wrote in her own hand, yet Munby's prompting, archive, and later editors shaped access. Sarah's diary was quoted through her famous son's autobiography. Elizabeth spoke through Annie's pen. There is no unmediated archive. There are degrees, routes, and declared or hidden interventions. The desire for pure access can produce bad history. It makes us trust a first-person pronoun too quickly, or reject a collaborative text too completely. The better approach follows the chain. Who created the experience? Who narrated it? Who inscribed it? Who preserved it? Who published it? Who is interpreting it now? Each answer changes confidence, not necessarily value. Elizabeth's book remains rare because extended memoirs by illiterate late Victorian urban women are rare. That rarity doesn't mean such women lacked stories. It means few stories crossed all required thresholds. Someone had to believe the telling worth hours. Someone needed paper and skill. Someone needed access to a publisher. Copies needed to survive. A scholar needed to connect the pseudonym with records. Remove one link, and Martha Grimes may vanish behind Elizabeth Dobbs. Remove another, and Elizabeth may remain only a cleaner in somebody else's account. This is the archive effect in its clearest form. Surviving evidence doesn't measure the amount of consciousness in the past. It measures, among other things, access to preservation. The people with the most papers aren't automatically the people with the richest inner lives. They are often the people whose social position supported paper. Privacy, literacy, storage, and institutional interest. Servants disrupted that pattern whenever they could. William used a small book to practice. Mary Ann paid to enter print. Hannah filled fragile sheets and posted them. Sarah wrote through changing pressures. Elizabeth found a listener with a pen. 5 routes, 5 different risks. The biggest popular histories of hidden servant life often promise secrets behind closed doors. The phrase works because servants saw private households. Yet the most consequential secret wasn't necessarily an employer's scandal. It was the servant's interpretation of ordinary power. Who was allowed to learn? Who controlled a character? Who had to live apart from family? Whose room disappeared with dismissal? Whose words required another hand? These questions expose mechanisms. They don't depend on invented confession. The authentic voices are more dramatic because they change what the house means. Great Cumberland Street becomes a barrier inside a marriage. A mistress's room becomes a place where skill is withheld. Hannah's gray card diary turns clean surfaces into accumulated hours. Uppark becomes both a library door and a platform of departure. A charwoman's table becomes a border between speech and print. The visible house stays the same. The moral map changes. That is why documented lives are stronger than composite servant tales. We don't need one fictional maid to experience every cruelty. 5 documented lives create a stronger sequence. Each carries an independent story engine. Together, they reveal a system without pretending uniformity. William was male, married, literate, and upwardly mobile. Mary Ann entered service as an orphaned girl and later became her own publisher. Hannah produced an extraordinary written record inside a complicated, intimate relation. Sarah moved from lady's maid to struggling wife to housekeeper and family archivist. Elizabeth, or Martha, crossed occupations and depended on oral collaboration. Their differences are evidence. Domestic service didn't create one personality. It created recurring pressures applied to different people. Housing attached to employment. Reputation attached to obedience. Knowledge attached to employer choice. Time attached to another household's needs. Survival attached to a chain of keepers. The final step in Elizabeth's story came long after publication. For years, readers could encounter Betty Dobbs without knowing the probable legal identity beneath the name. Florence Boose compared the narrative with census and civil evidence. The pattern pointed toward Martha Grimes, born in 1843 and living until 1926. The identification restored a second record around the book. It didn't dissolve every contradiction. Some details still appear fictionalized by speaker or scribe. The result is not a solved puzzle with every piece locked. It is a more honest map of what can be known. Martha is probable. Elizabeth is textual. Annie is the named chronicler. The story belongs to their unequal collaboration and to the records that let us test it. That modern identification is the final event in our chain. It changes the woman from a vivid pseudonym into a probable historical person while preserving the warning that recovery can never be complete. We can now answer the question Hannah's evening opened. When service controlled hours, housing, character, and future reference, what could a worker still keep? A worker could keep judgment. Sometimes she could keep ink. Sometimes she could keep a sequence of memories long enough to speak them. Keeping the evidence beyond one lifetime required other people. That dependence could rescue a voice and reshape it. William kept a daily self in a cramped book. Mary Ann kept comparison across 13 places and made it public. Hannah kept the order of labor and the names of her own thresholds. Sarah kept the young woman behind the future mother and the senior servant behind the famous son. Elizabeth kept a life through speech when writing had been denied to her. None possessed complete control. All left more than the household expected us to hear. Return to Hannah on that July evening. The dishes are done. She has washed. The pages are written and sent. We cannot see the exact room, but we can follow the action because her record survives. The house claimed the work that came first. The ink claimed what came after. Then follow the ink through every door. It travels from a footman's little journal to a self-published memoir. It crowds Hannah's ivory paper and thins under Sarah's exhaustion. At the last table, it moves in Annie's hand while another woman speaks. The material changes. The problem remains. Who gets to make a life durable? The answer isn't simply the literate. It is the literate with time, paper, privacy, preservation, a route to readers, or someone willing to provide what is missing. That is the truth worth telling someone after hearing these lives. Victorian servants were not silent because they lacked inner lives or judgments. The record is quiet because access was unequal and survival selective. Some left millions of words. Some printed their own defense. Some survived in a son's quotations. Some needed a scribe. Behind every surviving page stands a second history of who was allowed to write, who was heard, and who kept the paper. The hidden words were never one locked collection of scandal. They were acts of attention taken back from work, a short walk instead of church, a memoir that names withheld learning, a packet posted before bed, a diary line about a peculiar gardener, a spoken life crossing into another woman's pen. The doors didn't all open. Enough ink passed through to change the house we thought we knew. The silence was not inside the servant. It was in the doors, between her life and our hearing.